Hello and welcome to my friend the Rainbow Circle. I've been wanting to talk about gender change. I still can't pronounce it. I've been trying to shoot this video, and I can't quite get it right. And one of the things that trips me up is that phrasing, gender change. There you go. I need to practice with that. And it's a difficult thing to really talk about because my interest is really in the aesthetics and the role it plays in stories. But it's such a politically charged issue. That it's hard to even talk about how the politics of it are not really my interest without that still being interpreted politically. So I do want to try to talk about it really carefully. So I've had to reshoot this and try this again a couple of times to try to really phrase it well. But the reason that I'm interested in talking about it, I mean, it's an interesting topic just regardless. But one of the reasons I'm really interested in talking about it is because I'm writing a story, part of the Opal Bean War project. The last few videos, next few videos are about the same project, but I'm writing a story called The Other Ones, and all these stories in the Opal Bean project are born from a prompt that I solicited, and the prompt that I'm working on with that one is was the androgynous mind, which is a really fascinating, definitely a fascinating prompt to try to meditate on how to really create a story out of. But it's from a quote by Virginia Woolf, and really my favorite Virginia Woolf story is Orlando, and that is a story that does have a gender change, where Orlando starts the story as male, ends the story as female, and there's all kinds of really other fascinating things that happen in that book. It's Virginia Woolf's most postmodern, aesthetically postmodern. I mean, postmodernism is another just bad term, but it's aesthetically postmodern. Magical realist story. Orlando's also like 400 years old. You know, there's all kinds of crazy things. The Thames River freezes over. You know, there's all kinds of crazy things that happen in that book. It's a great book. Um, so just meditating on how to really do the androgynous mind and getting inspiration from Orlando. Um, that's one of the things I wanted to explore is just the role of gender change in a text. And it doesn't happen all that often. I mean, that you can, you know, depending on how you really define it, you can look at a lot of the Shakespeare plays, and you know, I'm riffing on Shakespeare for some of these the Opal Bean War stories. But you can look at Shakespeare plays, and I mean, a lot of the times when you have, you know, women dressing as men, for example, in those plays, you know, you can certainly relate that to just the necessity of um, having male actors playing female characters anyway. You know, there's a lot of things that go into that, but it's still, you know, it still challenges the taken for granted norms of gender binaries in some complicated ways. There's so many different variations on that. One of my favorites is Ozma from the Oz series. It's a really fascinating character and a surprising sort of a character. This uh, Ozma of Oz. Marvelous Land of Oz was where she showed up first. Um, she starts Marvelous Land of Oz, which is book 2 in the Oz series. She starts as a boy. Seemingly, she starts as a boy, but it's revealed by the end that she was magically changed into a boy when she was just a baby, and so she was raised as a boy. And then by the end of the book, she's changed back into a girl. And what's really fascinating about that, you know, especially interpreting it on the political level, um, what's really fascinating about that one, especially, is how everyone reacts to that around here. And I think, I mean, my fascination with Ozma as a character, partly, honestly, is due to wondering if more people knew about that book, that might be a really interesting book to certainly give trans kids as inspiration, and to say, you know, take a look at this example of um, someone who has this really positive support system. Because that's what happens is Ozma, everyone supports her and says, you know, we will love you no matter what. And this very heartwarming sort of ending about all these people, you know, saying you, uh, we first came to know you as a girl, now as a boy, now you're a girl, but that doesn't change how much we love you. And so that really eases her all of her anxieties about changing. And it's a magical change, so I mean it doesn't translate perfectly by any means, but on that level, I think it's a if my son goes through that sort of confusion ever, I would give him that book and say, this is the best way to respond. Or if there's a family, whose kid is going through that, take a look at Ozma. Here's how all of her friends are responding to this recognition that she was destined to be a girl. And here's all the really positive reinforcement. But in terms of just doing that aesthetically, how to really accomplish that in my story, the other ones, it's a challenging thing to do really well. But that's sort of the goal of that story is to meditate on that idea of the androgynous mind, the idea that mentally we are capable of being androgynous, of having mentally being male and female. How do you meditate on that idea? I'm oversimplifying Virginia Woolf's really complicated ideas, but that's kind of what she's riffing on in Orlando. Is Orlando truly male or female, or both? So really interesting thing to meditate on. But in my story, the other ones, I'm trying to explore those ideas and sort of the landmine. I mean, there's so many landmines regardless in this topic, of course, but sort of the landmine that I'm trying to tiptoe around is that I want to make sure to really root it in really organic characters who are making their own choices and giving agency to the characters, just no matter what. So, not stripping them of the characters themselves of their agency. And really discovering what they want out of the story. And that's kind of whenever I talk about that, it kind of sounds crazy, just letting the characters choose for themselves. And then honoring and support them when they make their choice about the direction of their character development. But basically the idea of the story, and doing that without forcing it into something that will feel really artificial and exploitative and trendy. I mean, that is definitely, if you're talking about gender fluidity and variety in variety across the spectrum of gender fluidity, it could very easily slip into feeling really artificial, feeling really exploitative, feeling really, just following a trend, like forcing this diversity of expressions of gender identity across this complicated spectrum. It very easily it could slip into this very artificial feeling thing, and that's absolutely something to avoid. But how to avoid that? By just discovering who the characters are, and that's really where I am in the process at the moment. So the concept is that it's sort of a sci-fi concept, which I'll talk about in a second. But the concept is that you have the city with these alien type of creatures. I don't really think they're aliens, but that's another issue. They sort of descend on the city, and they're called the Muscovites. That's an Orlando reference. And so the Muscovites, that is reference to Orlando. Of course, it's people from Moscow, not aliens, but it's just a fun word. That's entirely why I call them that, just because it's a fun word. But they have 4-part brains, and they say each part of their brains is connected to one of the 4 different genders. So that sort of drives people crazy. They say, what are the 4 genders? And there's a lot of it's debate about that. I have no real settled answer for that. That's just something to prompt people debating it. And so to really do that effectively and avoid really relying on exploitative, trendy sort of things. It's ground up sort of character development. They know what the situation is. How do they respond to the situation? What sort of choices do they make, and what have you? And eventually, um, that they'll present the power to for characters to change genders, sort of like with Ozma of Oz. It'll be more of a magical change, so it won't be exactly translatable to real life issues, although it will touch on them. It won't be exactly translatable. It will be more of the magical sort of gender change. Um, and sci-fi, it's just in some ways it's an easier way to deal with this stuff. It's kind of a cowardly choice. I'm not, you know, uh, I'm not always prone to sci-fi for that reason. And I say cowardly, and not as a criticism. I mean, it's a totally valid choice. I love sci-fi. I would never dismiss it in any way, but it's a way of tempering something really disruptive, and I think that's one of the big misunderstandings of sci-fi. Is that it presents a lot of these deeply disruptive concepts about the nature of reality. It'll take some sort of natural law and really disrupt it in some deeply stimulating ways, but then it frames it in terms of science fiction, or it displaces it in some really significant way. So if you think about gender fluidity, you look at something like Left Hand of Darkness. Lots and lots of stories like that. A lot of the Octavia Butler stories will really play around with the role of gender or the nature of gender. And commonly how that's interpreted is as speculation, as speculative fiction about what the future might be. And I think as a writer, that's an ineffective way to really even consider it. And as I said, the more potent, substantial thing to do is to consider what the characters are freely choosing to do. And if you take that top-down approach and say, they're choosing to do whatever I intellectually decide is what the future is going to hold. I think that's an unproductive way to really consider sci-fi. And I would say that's a different way than most people consider sci-fi. Um, but I mean, if you think of any sort of sci-fi and you say, sci-fi is valuable because it helps us see the future and imagine what new technology would be like. If you apply the Mogon, which is just my test for essential values of any sort of story, and you said, apply the Mogon to sci-fi, and you say, um, sci-fi is good because it helps us see the future and the developments of technology. Let's say that's the value that we place in sci-fi. Take that same sort of standard and apply it to any sci-fi that you love, and you say, is that the reason that I love it? And apply it to a different sci-fi that you love and say, is that the reason that I love it? Uh, Compare that to a standard like the characters are really compelling and interesting and fascinating. I love them. Like, I'm a huge Star Trek fan, and I recognize that Star Trek gives us the vision of the future. Oh, it's so valuable because it showed us what a cell phone would look like, before cell phones were invented. But I don't think I would watch, Measure of a Man, or our Best of both worlds, or any sort of just amazing episode of Next Generation, Chain of Command. There's so many, Tin Man. There's so many really great episodes of Star Trek, and I wouldn't watch, or Star Trek, The Next Generation. I wouldn't watch them and have my first impression would be, um, it's so good because it shows me what the future will be like and what technology will look like. Um, that's a difficult standard to really apply to any of those things. But if you say, honestly, I would say I watch Star Trek: The Next Generation because I love Picard and Data, and my heart goes out to them and they fill me with love. That is the genuine reason. So if you look at Measure of a Man, even something like that, which is a debate about technology, I would say ultimately I feel for that episode because I worry for Data's well-being, and I feel for this character who's unable to feel things. And the same goes with if you're couching a sort of meditation on just the notion of gender fluidity in a sci-fi piece, is the value the actual debate? that's how a lot of people will interpret sci-fi. They'll say it's a way of approaching intellectual debate in a displaced sort of way. I would say it's a way of tempering really disruptive concepts, taken for granted concepts of the existence, and displacing them to some separate world or into the future, some separate time, in order to get a proper proportion of deeply disruptive challenges of natural law, and in order to threaten the characters uh, without uh, distancing the reader too much, without having something super disruptive that is highly stimulating and presents a danger to the characters, without forcing the reader to turn away. It's not too disruptive. It's tempered in the framework of science fiction. Um, that being said, I'm going to reference so many different genres. I think one of the fascinating things, thinking of it scientifically, here's a more logical linkage. Thinking of it scientifically, if you have a scientific theory, you test it based on what sort of predictions it leads to. Like this particular scientific theory leads to the prediction that of gravitational waves or whatever. By finding gravitational waves, you prove that it's true. Um, the rainbow circle predicts that there should be far more gender fluidity in stories than there actually is, which is something to really meditate on. Just the nature of the rainbow circle is that right at the center you have stimulation of an experience born from disruption of dualities, dismissing dualities. And most helpfully, that's the duality that to value is the duality, or to dismiss. The dismissal of a duality that most valuable to storytelling is the happy sad duality. So the good emotions, bad emotions duality. So our logic tells us that, when we have this either or perspective of existence, our tendency is to say happiness is good and sadness is bad, or happiness is good and anger is bad. Good emotions are good, bad emotions are bad. Once we accept that's just not true, and we recognize the stimulant potential of embracing negative emotions through empathetic experiences, and even empathy itself is an essential dismissal of duality, because we have the duality that separates human beings. I'm incapable of feeling what you feel if I adhere to the duality of that firm separation between human beings' feelings. And dismissal of sadness as a universal negative is one of the barriers to feeling empathy. So if I see someone who's sad and I say, we are separate human beings, I'm sounding like a robot now. We are separate human beings, and sadness makes me feel bad, and I should never ever feel sadness ever. It's a universal bad. That's a barrier to my ability to feel empathy for someone. But in a story, if someone is sad, you automatically feel sad, and you would just embrace that. You wrap your arms around that character and you say, I feel really bad that you feel really bad. Let's feel really bad together. And it's this intense emotional experience you have with the character. And that's at the center of the rainbow circle. That's the value, is the dismissal of these dualities. At the other end of the rainbow circle is the drive towards comfort, and just the nature of the rainbow circle is you're being pulled back and forth. Where do you really fall as you're being pulled back and forth between stimulation of direct experience, dismissing dualities at the center of the rainbow circle, and the drive towards comfort at the outer rim of the rainbow circle. And the mechanisms of comfort include things like hierarchy and duality, so reaffirming just the duality of existence. So here's where the other genre comes in. Not that it will help to load in the genres, but if you think of hero's journey stories, this is where I find hero's journey stories really helpful. I have lots of problems with hero's journey as a scheme. I think a lot of people misunderstand how to really use it. But if you read Joseph Campbell, I read tons of Joseph Campbell many, many years ago, but if you read Joseph Campbell, one thing he is fascinated by and really fixated on is non-duality. One of the hero's journey elements that I would argue is the most significant, one of the most significant, is master of two worlds. The idea that the hero becomes a hero by essentially recognizing the unification of the physical and the spiritual world, and dismissing a lot of the dualities that have separated their concepts, kept them in the safe space of the known world and ventured into the unknown and dangerous world. So if you consider two different types of heroes, I know this sounds really dualistic, but they're not. They're seemingly opposite. They're not really opposite, but they're seemingly opposite. But if you consider two different types of heroes, the conqueror hero and the trickster hero, the nature of the conqueror hero is to return homeostasis. So if you could apply this to so many different types of heroes. The conqueror hero will be in a homeostatic space, a kingdom or what have you. There will be something that disrupts the homeostasis. A monster will enter the kingdom. If you think of a really basic story, a monster will enter the kingdom, and the hero returns homeostasis, defeats the monster, what have you. Trains, or there's middle parts like trains with a mentor or whatever other part of the hero's journey story you want to look at. But the end of the story is the homeostasis. So what a lot of people will get mixed up is that the purpose of the story is homeostasis. That what you learn from a conquering hero story is that homeostasis is good, and that danger from a monster is bad. But if you look at it as a story, the story itself is the monster attacking. The story is disruption of homeostasis. The coexistence of all of these seemingly conflicting states. There's that. But if you consider the trickster hero, seemingly the opposite, not necessarily, but seemingly the opposite. The trickster hero is specifically aiming to disrupt homeostasis. So if you think about what is a culture's value, if a conqueror hero can be a hero and a trickster hero can be a hero, if you say the story teaches us that homeostasis is good, then a trickster can never be a hero. And in Western civilization, much more commonly, the trickster is depicted as, a devil figure. But there are lots of cultures where the trickster is depicted as a heroic figure. Very commonly, you have different stories. You have a smaller amount of stories in Western civilization, but you do have a handful of stories where the trickster is a heroic figure. But the trickster is disrupting homeostasis. The trickster is recognizing when some sort of homeostatic condition is cruel and horrible and dehumanizing and what have you, disrupts that hierarchy. If you think about just all the different mechanisms of destimulation, hierarchy is definitely one of them. And you could say, most frequently the trickster hero is a hero when the hierarchy is unjust. You could argue, I'll cede that part of it. You can argue that you can learn the lesson about unjust hierarchies for sure. But I would say from a story perspective, the value to really glean from that particular contrast between the conqueror hero and the trickster hero is that both can be stories. If both can be stories, then it's much harder to say that the goal of the story or the purpose of the story is the return of homeostasis, when the trickster's delight and joy and reading about the trickster is the disruption of homeostasis. It's hard to say that all stories are leading towards that same sort of lesson. And that's one of my problems with the common interpretation of the hero's journey, is that they all have the same lesson. They don't, clearly. Or that lessons are really all that relevant. What's relevant is that the story comes from the disruption of the homeostasis. That being said, now that I've said the word homeostasis 10,000 times, very important concept in writing, but, one of the qualities of the trickster is the fluid gender of the trickster. So an example would be Loki. Loki is definitely depicted most often as a villain. He can be a hero, but most often as a villain. But he has a very fluid gender, and even Marvel Comics has played around with this. He's shown up as a female character before on occasion. Um, so uh, the trickster breaks down hierarchies and dualities on multiple levels. One of which being this duality of gender. But I would say, in terms of the role that plays in a story, and even you can even look at a really basic example like the Shakespeare stories where characters dress up as a different gender. What happens at the end of the story? It returns to homeostasis. Uh, Arguably, the reason why it's not more common, scientifically, it would predict, the Rainbow Circle would predict very commonly that more and more stories should include some sort of gender fluidity. I think it's such a deeply seated duality. All of the different dualities, there's so many different dualities. It's such a deeply seated duality that I think people might view that as such a significant disruption of comfort that they might be more resistant to that, except when couched in things like science fiction and trickster stories, things where that really significant disruption of that comforting duality um, is tempered a bit for that helps people to accept it. And that's not a political statement. That's just an aesthetic recognition of the role that gender shifting plays in stories and why does it show up in particular proportions. In no way am I saying how that should apply to the real world necessarily. I certainly have opinions, but those are irrelevant to what I'm really talking about. So I do want to make that clear. I am really just talking about uh, how does gender shifting manifest in stories, and why does it manifest in stories, and what sort of implications does that have for the basic components of storytelling? That's really all I'm talking about. So just want to make sure that's clear. Um, so just my approach. It's still a story that I'm exploring where the story itself wants to go. The other ones, I mean, really exploring where the story itself wants to go, trying to tiptoe around so many different, really complicated landmines that come with this kind of story. But I'm just drilling deep down into just the character level and just listening to the characters and seeing where they want the story to go. I haven't quite come to a conclusion yet about where they really want to go. There are choices that they can make. I have a mechanism in the story where they can change their gender if they want to. They have characters there challenging these really rigid, taken for granted dualities. And at present, I'm sort of exploring, a lot of the complicated sort of relationships that don't really have a good, clear, defining name for them. Different sorts of love that you can have for people that don't necessarily fall within a clear category. And so, in the mechanism of having this capacity to change gender and challenging, really rigid gender dynamics, that really basic conception, what sort of choices will these characters make? And if I'm really rooting it deep, deep down in really organically created characters who make their own decisions, then ideally, I don't know if it'll work yet. These are works in progress. So I'm not saying, here's a successful story where I successfully did this, do what I'm doing. I'm just saying, here's a really difficult challenge that I'm facing, and here's how I'm trying to face that challenge. But if I do it that way, hopefully I will avoid some of the landmines, especially landmines like exploitative treatment of gender fluidity or choosing it just because it's trendy. Ideally, it will come from the characters, and the characters themselves will show me what they really need, instead of me forcing it on them based on some sort of need to fulfill this sort of political agenda or trend towards uh, you know trend towards exploitative treatment of multiple gender expressions and what have you. Anyway, it's tricky. It's very, very tricky. That's my conclusion. It's not an easy thing to do, but that's the strategy I'm employing at the moment, and stay tuned to see if it actually works. But anyway, I'll see you on the next episode.